Welcome everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so I think we will get started. We have 3 great presenters today. And first, I'm just going to introduce Haley Prevost from Department of Women and Gender Equality, who's going to be our moderator for the day. Haley's worked for the Government of Canada as a public servant since 2017 and has worked as an analyst at Women and Gender Equality since 2020. She has a Master of Arts from the University of Ottawa. And take it away, Haley.
Thank you so much. As mentioned, I'm Haley Prevost, and I go by she and her pronouns, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations. I recognize that people attending today's webinar are joining us from different traditional Indigenous territory. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the land in which you are joining us from today. Miigwech. As Grant said, I work as an analyst in the Research, Results and Delivery branch at Women and Gender Equality Canada, also referred to as WAGE. WAGE works to advance gender equality through an intersectional gendered lens, working in partnerships with key stakeholders, including civil society organizations, labor groups, the private sector, other orders of government, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The department actively promotes the inclusion of all people in Canada's economic, social, and political life. WAGE works to uphold its mandate to advance gender equality by performing a central coordination function within the Government of Canada, by developing and implementing policies, providing grants and contributions, delivering programs, investing in research, and providing advice to achieve equality for people of all genders, including women. An example of our investment in research is through our collaboration with the CRDCN. WAGE has funded a total of 4 individual projects and 1 team project in defined priority areas to support evidence-based policy development, programs, and services. Today, we have the pleasure of having 3 of the funding recipients join us and present key research findings. Their research projects address key knowledge gaps pertaining to the gender wage gap, parental leave, and gender labor market transitions that will help inform decision-making at WAGE. While listening to each presenter, please do not hesitate to jot down any questions or comments that may arise. There will be an opportunity to ask questions or provide comments after each presentation. I will now take the time to introduce our first presenter, Neeru Gupta. Neeru is an associate professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick. Her research uses population-based survey and administrative data sources focusing on gender and social equity to accelerate the quadruple aim for healthcare improvement, healthy populations, sustainable investments, and better patient and provider experiences. I welcome Neeru.
Thank you very much, Haley, and thanks to everybody who's taken the time, I was going to say on this beautiful afternoon, to join us for this webinar, but I understand that that's not necessarily the case across the country. So I'm joining you from beautiful, sunny Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I'd like to start off by, of course, thanking WAGE and the CRDCN for their support throughout this research. And I know how to do this. Despite 2 years of pandemic, I'm still not entirely sure how to. Am I sharing the screen properly, Haley? Can you see my screen?
Yes, you are. Yes, I can see it.
Thank you. So my research is, well, it was new to me, but there is actually a fair amount of research on there, persistent, across countries, across labor markets, and over time, highlighting that there is a gender wage gap in the labor market. I mean, as I said, this was relatively new to me. So I was rather astonished to find that it still persists in the Canadian labor market as well. Now, one of the challenges is that oftentimes there may be resistance to admitting that this gender wage gap actually exists because it's often attributed simply to women's choices in particular occupations or sectors of employment that mean they might lead to lower paid jobs. So our research focused on, well, what about those working within occupations with similar educational qualifications, similar working conditions? Particularly, we looked at 13 occupations within the knowledge-intensive health, education, and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics professions who have a university degree. The theory would suggest that in the knowledge economy, gender wage gaps should be decreasing as people are, both men, women, gender diverse persons, are increasingly recruited because of their educational requirements into these sometimes labeled prestigious occupations in the knowledge economy, rather than on their personal characteristics. We were also interested, and perhaps this is our own personal bias as researchers coming from a relatively smaller and more rural province, on how these labor market opportunities in the knowledge economy may affect women and men professionals differently by their place of residence, and in particular, going beyond the dichotomy of urban-rural and recognizing that rurality itself is often under-recognized for its heterogeneity. Our research stemmed from, I'm certain there are others on this panel who can speak to this even better than I can, gender wage equity policies, talk about equal pay for equal work. So if this has been the standard in Canada for decades of pay equity policy, why is there still such controversy around how wages should be measured, resistance to admitting that gender wage gaps are real, and that more research is still needed to address this form of social inequality? So we revisited that central question that's often used in understanding gender wage gaps. Do women earn less than men because of who they are, what they do, or where they work? And we formulated 3 research hypotheses. First, based on the literature that suggests in the general Canadian labor market, women earn on average 87 cents to every dollar earned by men, we postulated that earnings differentials would be less amongst the highly educated, knowledge-based health, education, and STEM professionals. Spoiler alert, it's not. Secondly, we hypothesized that the gender wage gap might be magnified for women working in certain occupations that are characterized by greater sex stratification and numerical dominance of women, regardless of gender parity in qualifications or other traditional human capital factors. And this is related to persistent societal devaluation of so-called women's work. And third, we postulated that the wage gap would be magnified for women working in more rural and remote parts of the country. There's a certain amount of research, limited though, because we are a predominantly urban country, so much of the research focuses on those large metropolitan areas, but there is some that suggests that there is regional disparity in the spatial distribution of knowledge-based human capital, but very, very little looking at how that may exacerbate or attenuate gender wage differences in those same sectors. So, of course, we leverage the fantastic resources made available through the Canadian Research Data Network. Oh my God, if these had been available when I was a grad student, my life would have been so different. But we pulled together the 2006 and 2016 Canadian Census microdata accessed in the Secure Research Data Center environment at the University of New Brunswick. And we took advantage of a new geocoded tool known as the Index of Remoteness, developed by Statistics Canada, now available in open access, that measures rurality, remoteness, and accessibility to population centers and services for all inhabited census subdivisions across the country. Again, beyond that dichotomous urban-rural definitions. So we looked at full-time degree holding professionals in our 13 groups of health, education, and STEM professionals as coded to the National Occupational Classification. And we looked at, as our outcome, employment income. So that is the annual income from employment or professional practice. And we include, of course, sex, a certain number of human capital variables, and a parsimonious set of social identity variables as potential confounders, and our residential remote list based on the index of remoteness. And we use sort of standard economic methods of multiple linear regression on logged earnings and the regression-based Blander-Huaca decomposition to tease out the components of gender wage gaps that may be explained versus those that remain unexplained by our measured predictors. So what are some of the key findings? Well, in some ways, it wasn't entirely a surprise in that professions that have traditionally tended to be female dominated, like nursing, tended to remain female dominated. There's a fair amount of attention in the research and in the media on feminization or increasing proportions of women in traditionally male dominated fields, particularly STEM. We would postulate, however, that efforts to increase women's representation in STEM and medical fields must go hand in hand with addressing sex segregation in traditionally female-dominated fields as well. We see some of that among general practitioners and among life scientists, which are increasingly feminizing. But what about getting more men into traditionally female-dominated positions as well? So as mentioned, our particular interest was also in the spatial distribution of these university-educated professionals across Canada. And what piqued our interest was that actually it was the female-dominated professionals, so life scientists, nursing professionals, and secondary teachers, whose distribution across the continuum of urbanity versus rurality were most closely approximating the general population. So that's the orange horizontal. That's the mean index of remoteness scale for the general Canadian population. And yet those male-dominated professions are also simultaneously amongst the most urbanized in the country. So there's a dynamic going on there that we certainly think it warrants closer attention. So what were our additional findings in terms of the gender wage gap? Okay, so we know some professions are more heavily dominated by women. We know that female-dominated professions tend to be more evenly distributed across that continuum of urbanity, rurality. Well, as mentioned, no, our first hypothesis was not held or confirmed by the data. Across these 13 occupations, women averaged 80 cents for every dollar earned by men, according to the 2016 census data. That gap is lowering, but it's still surprisingly even greater than the general Canadian labor market. We also found that the lowest wages, again, possibly a reflection of that societal devaluation of occupations that are female dominated and more rapidly feminizing, were the salaries tended to be much lower than those in male-dominated occupations with similar educational qualifications and similar working conditions, by definition within the National Occupational Classification. Our bivariate analysis upheld that there was a significant gender wage gap within each occupation. So much of the research on the labor force uses occupation itself as a teaser or a tracer for gender-based differences in wages. But we found even within highly educated professional workers, a significant wage gap persisted. women tended to earn about 5 to 13% less than men after adjusting for differences in human capital, social identity variables, and their residential characteristics. And this was stable across the two census periods. Based on the Blender-Oaxaca decomposition method, we found that the human capital factors did offer explanatory insights into the gender wage gap among some of the professions, life scientists, mathematicians. So that's traditionally the argument given by pure economists, that human capital factors explain the gender wage gap. But we found that much of the gap still remained unexplained after controlling for these other variables. Often this unexplained part can be attributed, at least in part, to some form of unmeasured and unmeasurable gender discrimination. While our interest had been in looking at residential remoteness, we did find very little explanatory power in this methods, in this variable. So it seems that gender is a much drives the experience of people in the health, education, and STEM workforces more than where people live. And again, this census period explained little of the difference. So despite changing patterns of women's representation, the actual wage gap has remained relatively stable over the decade of observation. So like any study using observational data, it's not perfect. Certain strengths and limitations can be found both within the data sources and our specific approach. I'll just highlight two here. So one is, I love the census. I don't know about you, but I was, yay, when I got the log 4 last time, yay. So, using of the census data offers many advantages for understanding labor markets and indeed dynamics within the population of Canada. And Statistics Canada is making efforts to leverage administrative data linked to the census data to help reduce response bias and increase the quantity and quality of income data, specifically through linking with tax records. Now, specifically, though, by using 2006 and 16 census data, this might have introduced some researcher bias in the sense that the actual coverage of linked tax records changed. It's very high in 2016, but was lower in 2006. So particularly for some professions, such as physicians working under a fee-for-service remuneration model, it's not entirely clear whether some of those time trends are more a reflection in the way that the income data was captured rather than a true trend in professional earnings. Secondly, one area, so the index of remoteness developed by Statistics Canada itself is continuous. And it's quite new. There's very, very little research as of yet published that is looking at this dynamic. And again, coming from a bit of a more rural province, we think that's partly perhaps related to the bias against research focusing on rural areas, but that's a whole other discussion. Because it's continuous, the data can be also grouped in different ways. And as of yet, there's very little consensus on how these categories of remoteness may best be grouped. So we used equal deciles, but there is definitely more research is needed on better understanding what are the cutoff points between remoteness categories that can help us better understand the spatial dimensions of the knowledge labor market. So what are some of the next steps? Well, there's a fair amount of emerging evidence that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women in the labor markets and the health and education workforces. More research is certainly needed, and timely monitoring on their impacts as well on STEM workforces, male-dominated, so perhaps not getting as much attention on those gender biases that may threaten to widen the gap. And we would suggest that more attention also needs to be made to the fact that wage depreciation affects women as well as men, because men working in female-dominated occupations tend to earn less than their counterparts working in male-dominated occupations despite similar education qualifications and similar working conditions. So this is a challenge then for health education and other sectors in recruiting and retaining top talent. We also identified some areas that need further research. So again, the finding that rural and remote communities tend to be home to the highest concentration of workers of both sexes in the most female-dominated or feminizing occupations is an area for further investigation. And at the time of the research, hopefully somebody can give us some light as to when we'll be able to get our hands on that 2021 census data, which includes for the first time in the world, gender as a non-binary social identity as distinct from sex will enable us to look beyond the binaries going forward. So thank you again. Thanks for taking your time off on this wonderful afternoon to listen to our research. Thanks to WAGE and to CRDCN for organizing it, this session. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging some of the many, many people who contributed towards this research over the last few months. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Neeru. That was a phenomenal presentation. I noticed that we have a question in the chat, so I'll start there. So the first question is, for the data used comparing male income to female income, did the selection remove those who might not be receiving full income, like maternity leave, part-time workers, that could impact gap measurement?
Yeah, so that's one of the many decision points working towards this research. And I don't know, I don't think I actually introduced myself. I'm not an economist. So, you know, there are others with a disciplinary background in economics, how can I say this diplomatically, who tend perhaps sometimes to argue that we need to control for variables to make the model perfect. And you know, models are, there's no model that is perfect. And as I always say to grad students, you have 13,852 different options. You know, pick the road that you are comfortable with your storytelling. So in the end, we did exclude part-time workers, and we did exclude those who might not have earned income because they were on maternity or parental leave or unemployed or other caregiving activities in the year before the census. And that's certainly an area where I think we will need to be doing more research. One of my graduate students who's also leveraging this resource to look at wage gaps among psychologists in Canada, for example, did include part-time workers itself. And just that gap between women being more often in part-time work compared to men was a huge contributor to an overall gender wage gap in the psychologist workforce.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I kind of had a follow-up question. I'm not as familiar with census data from the labor standpoint, but I'm more familiar with the labor force survey. So I did notice, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you use the mean average, like the annual wage, correct? Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering what the justification was behind there, or if the census only provides annual. Just given our background at WAGE, we often do median, not often, but typically median and based on hourly wage. So I'm just wondering if that was something that you could explore.
Sure. So if I remember correctly from the gender results framework, there were actually 4 different indicators of wages that are being monitored by WAGE. If I confuse it here, by women gender equality wage on professional earnings wage, you know, mean hourly, median annual, and mean annual. So we did use the latter. So there were a couple of things. So one of the challenges with the census data versus a labor force survey data is that the reference period isn't captured the same in the census. So the census is capturing income from the tax records, which is based on the full calendar year preceding the census reference week, whereas hours worked was for the census reference week. So when we looked at the data, we did see that there were people who worked large numbers of hours in the census reference week, but had no income in the previous calendar year, or who had large incomes in the previous calendar year, but then reported no hours worked in the census reference week, which is May of the following calendar year. So either, so that's either we assume that they maintained that, or we go with the annual and not use the full-time, part-time, which is what we controlled for, which is also refers to the calendar year. So it's not perfect. And then just a census geeky detail is that the median is statistically based on a single point. So it doesn't actually meet Statistics Canada's privacy protocols to release data based on a single point of income data. So income itself is one of the most highly sensitive and privacy controlled variables in the census itself.
That's
so we could have done all the analyses, but we couldn't actually report the descriptive on the median because technically, statistically, it's based on a point.
Which makes sense. That's great. Thank you so much. Yes, and then there's also a comment in the chat about when Census 2022 or 2021 data will be available, which is October 19th, 2022.
October 19th in the RDC? Woo, happy dance.
In the RDC, yes, I would assume yes, because the RDC had made the comments.
Whoa.
Oh,
No. This is our data forum event. So the census team is coming to the event for us on October 19th.
Fabulous.
I cannot comment on the actual release date.
Okay, so I mean, many data have been released, I guess, publicly by Statistics Canada, but in specific, like I know the gender data was released in a public forum already, but it's the microdata that, and of course, it takes time to clean the data. It takes time to link it to the administrative tax records data. I fully recognize that, there is a lag between data capture and data readiness for research use.
Mm-hmm.
They know we want it, don't worry.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and I just had another question. What do you think was the most interesting finding through your research? What do you think, what is something that you would really want to see WAGE kind of take out and potentially approach our policies and program folk with, suggestions for some sort of policy reform or design?
Well, I think in this day and age, knowledge is power. And when we talk about the knowledge economy, but we also talk about knowledge is power and sharing of knowledge as power. So the more transparent we are with our salaries in recruitment, our salaries in our position, opportunities for promotion, the more those opportunities and the negotiating power comes within our realm. And there's certainly a balance between putting the onus on the individual to fight for equal treatment and the structures themselves. And I think those have to go hand in hand.
Yes, absolutely. Tammy, I think you can just unmute.
Hi, I felt a bit odd jumping in, but I can't get myself into the Q&A. One thing I was just thinking about, there's a literature out there about how couples make location decisions. right? That I think seems really relevant, especially thinking about your doctors and some of these other professionals, where a single learner couple will tend to be more remote, and the dual learner couple, and especially dual career couples, tend to move into urban areas to be able to do the family juggling with schools and childcare. And so with the census files, I'm wondering if maybe you can try to link some of these individuals to their spouses to account for that in some way.
So we, I'm going to put my graduate student, Adrienne Gulliver, on the spot here. I don't think I'm not sure if she's participating today, but we tried to push her to do that with the psychologists' data. And in the end, it was just enough to kind of learn how to do the methods themselves, kind of navigating even just the different ways that wages, earnings can be measured is in itself, can be a rationale for, a manuscript being accepted or rejected by a publication, by a journal. It's a complex landscape, more complex, I think, than we had originally expected it to be as well. So in the end, my graduate student did decide not to go down that road of trying to link couples together, but she did look specifically at parents versus non-parents and did find upholding of the motherhood earnings penalty and some evidence of the fatherhood earnings bonus.
That is very interesting. Thank you. In the spirit of disaggregated data, was there anything that you tried to look at, like let's say immigration status or visible minority variables or anything down that road?
Yeah, so couldn't present everything today, but the paper's just been accepted into Canadian Studies and Population. So please do keep an eye out for that for all the details. So we did find an earnings penalty for visible minorities as well. So those are the social identity variables that we were talking about, as well as, so we captured immigrants in terms of those who immigrated in adulthood. So those who would have experienced, distinguishing those who would have experienced their minimally, their basic education in Canada. My brother was 6 months old when he immigrated. To me, just born in Canada versus not didn't make much sense in terms of the, factors that lead to accessing higher education or first experiences on the labor market. Sorry, I'm digressing here. So in terms of the findings that we did find that particularly in STEM, many more adult migrants compared to, for example, secondary teachers. We did find it was not a sort of uniform across these occupations in terms of their social identity characteristics. One finding that did surprise us, that we did see another study in Canadian Studies and Population by Goldman and all that found something similar, was university educated persons of Indigenous identity didn't necessarily suffer from devaluated earnings. Again, it's, there's a huge selection going on there, but once Indigenous persons with a university degree accessed the labor market, there wasn't necessarily an earnings penalty.
Very interesting, and I definitely look forward to reading the published article. So congratulations on that front. It's always exciting, right? I'm just going to do one last call if anybody else has any questions. Okay, well, thank you so much, Neeru. This has been a phenomenal presentation and we've learned so much. And again, really looking forward to seeing the publication.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so I think we're going to move on to our second presenter, which is Fabian Lange. Fabian Lange is a professor of economics at McGill University and Canada Research Chair Tier 2. He held his first position at Yale University and has held visiting positions at the University of Chicago, Oberlin College, University of Michigan, and Ferdinand Braudel Scholar at European University Institute. Dr. Lange's research interests are in labor and personnel economics. So welcome, Fabian.
Thank you. Let me just share the slides here. Can you see my slides or?
Yes, we can.
Very well. Thank you very much for, well, first for funding this research and now for letting me present it. This is joint work with a PhD student, final year PhD student at McGill University, who is really excellent. I put the order of names on this slide without really paying attention. There should not be any precedence assigned to it. He was really at least equally responsible. I will blame him for anything that I need explaining. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is peer effects in paternity leave. And in particular, the research question that we pursued in this project is to estimate first whether there are peer effects in taking paternity leave among male co-workers. So the idea that new fathers might become more likely to take paternity leave if they have co-workers who are themselves taking paternity leave, who have taken paternity leave themselves. And then to get a handle on how strong these peer effects are. So why do we think is an interesting question? Well, one justification for extensive paternity leave policies, and an increasing number of countries is moving in that direction, is that there are social norms that prevent fathers from taking leave. And many of these social norms presumably act at the workplace level. But it's actually quite difficult to produce solid empirical work on the strength of these social interactions. In particular, one should note that just observing strong group effects, in our case, workplace effects, is not sufficient to establish a causal link. There are many reasons why we might observe a lot of correlation across groups in paternity leave taking or parental leave taking more general. Some workplaces are more amenable to that, and people who are fathers who might be more likely to take parental leave, paternity leave, might be locating in those workplaces. So how are we going to go about resolving this problem? How are we going to go about getting solid causal evidence on this question? Well, we're going to use the paternity leave reform in 2006 in Quebec to isolate quasi-experimental variation in the incentives to take paternity leave. That induces variation in take-up in a peer population. That quasi-experimental variation that I'm referring to here, that arises from the timing of the births of newborns among peers around the reform date, right? So eligibility of the reform was dated to January 1st, 2006. And what we essentially will do, we're going to use regression-based approaches to this, but essentially what we will do is we will compare peers of fathers whose newborns were born just before January 1st and just after January 1st, 2006. And to the extent that this timing of the birth is random, we can use that as this variation that mimics the setup of an experiment, which is why I call this quasi-experimental. And then we're going to use that variation in peer take-up that is induced by birth timing around the reform to look at take-up decision among co-workers who have children in a later time period, so 6 to 18 months after the reform. Right? And to do this, we need to this is a very data-intensive setup, right? We need to identify individuals who have births 6 to 18 months after the reform, so fathers to newborns 6 to 18 months after the reform. We need to identify their workplaces. Then we need to roll back in time to find the peer population that was working with them 6 months, well, around the implementation of the reform, right? And then we need to look in that peer population. We need to identify parents, fathers who have newborns either before or after January 1st, right? So you can imagine that we need both administrative data to link parents to their newborns, to link parents to their workplaces, and then through the workplaces to the peer population. And we're using the seed data. This is basically drawing on T1 and T4 tax data and the record of employment to identify the workplace, the set of the peers, and of course, the leave-taking decision itself. So what is the reform that we're exploiting here? This is just a very broad brush characterization of parental leave policies in Canada since about 2000. But in January 1st, 2006, Quebec broke free from the system in place in the rest of Canada and instituted changes to the parental leave policies under the current Quebec Parental Leave Insurance Plan, which is what it's called. There are a variety of changes there. The benefit rate increased, but what particularly is of interest to us here is that there is an introduction of paternity leave. We're calling it here paternity leave. It's essentially leave that is targeted at the second partner, right? Which happens in practice to be predominantly the father. By second partner, I mean the partner that the partner to the mother is essentially what I'm saying. And then I'm also listing a later reform that brought the rest of Canada along this dimension. And maybe in future years, WAGE is willing to finance me again to evaluate that reform. Okay, so our empirical strategy here is we're going to find a set of what I call the index fathers, right? So this is essentially the unit of observation that we focus on to identify these causal effects, right? These are fathers of newborns between July 1st, 2006 and December 31st, 2008. We then assign to these index fathers a set of co-workers in the same firm. This shouldn't say same establishment, it's actually the same firm with newborns between July 2005 and June 2006. Okay. The results I'm going to show you today also limits the attention to firms with less than 500 workers on the notion that these type of peer effects require interactions between index and peer fathers, and that we cannot identify more precisely the peer group in very large firms, if we focus on very large firms. And then we're going to look at the variation in peer birth dates around January 1st, 2006 to provide us with this exogenous variation. And this whole thing is going to take place within what is called the regression discontinuity design. So we essentially are running regressions where we control for the birth dates of the peer children themselves. And then in these regressions, we include dummy variables for whether or not the birth was just before or after January 1st, 2006. Okay. There's a whole range of methodological choices that have to be made along the way here that I chose not to bore you with. What I want to talk instead is the broad range of results that we are getting. So first, we find that access to paternity leave in the peer group caused an increase in the rate of leave taking of 21 percentage points. Right? So this is actually somewhat smaller than some of the other estimates for that same reform that are in the literature. So Patnaik has a paper where she finds impact on leave taking among peer fathers. They are twice as big than this, but this is essentially what we are finding in this data. We are then exploring, as I said previously, the effect of this on paternity leave taking among the index fathers. So the second point here refers to the what's called the reduced form effect. So that is essentially what is the difference in leave taking between index fathers that have a peer whose child was born just before, as opposed to just after, as opposed to just before the reform. And so if the peer had a birth that was born just after the reform, so therefore that peer, if the index father had a peer whose child was born just after the reform, that caused a 4.3% increase in leave taking among index fathers. Okay. Now, what follows from these two numbers and what will follow in a regression discontinuity design is that we can identify the causal effect of peer taking on the propensity of an index father of taking leave. And our estimate of this is 21%, percentage points, I should say. So what that means is that we estimate that in a firm with less than 500 workers, a father of a newborn who has in the previous year experienced that a peer has taken paternity leave, that increase in peer paternity leave taking will cause an increase in paternity leave taking among the father himself, the index father himself, of 21 percentage points. So that's quite a sizable number. So to conclude, what we do in this project is we demonstrate in what we think is a causally convincing manner that there are really strong peer effects at the workplace in the propensity to take parental leave between male co-workers. Why did I engage in this research? Really, my interest in this was generated by reading a paper by Dahl and co-authors exploring a quite similar research methodology with a similar type of reform in Norway. They found estimates that of strong peer effects as well that were about twice the size of those that we are finding. So reading that study, I was first quite skeptical on whether we would find similar results, but sometimes the research convinces you that actually these peer effects are real and that they are strong. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? I can start with one. I would be very interested to see if we could do, follow up to the 2019, right? So I guess, we're under the presumption that with providing these policies, with putting them in place, that we would increase the uptake of parental leave, correct? That's yeah.
The hope.
That's the hope. Yeah. So it would be interesting to see. Now, I was just wondering if you had access with the data sets that you were using to location at all. Like, would that ever be a possibility to see?
Yes, we do have access to location, and we were thinking about using that to actually narrow down, to actually extend essentially the estimation to larger firms, right? So what I have in mind here is that there are many firms with multi-location establishments, like retail, Tim Hortons, since we're, and by narrowing it down using the location data, we might be able to, these are actually locations of the workers themselves that we would have, we might be able to narrow down more narrow peer categories. So that is one thing that we would have liked to do. That was actually quite difficult to do. The data requirements are quite large, but this is a direction that we would like to take it in. But I think you might have in mind, are there heterogeneous effects across types of locations, or is that kind of the dimension along which you're thinking, or?
Yes, like I would just be very curious, looking at Quebec, for example, for this sample, if it was like, does Montreal, like, let's say, is there more uptake in a really big metropolitan area compared to a rural, and also what kind of jobs, right? Like I'm just thinking something, okay, Government of Canada, for example, versus Tim Hortons, for example, right?
Yes. So unfortunately, occupation is not going to be something that we will be able to look at, right? So I think that there are some very interesting cuts that we would like to do. I think one of them, in terms of type of jobs, that I think is very relevant is actually along the earnings distribution, or the income distribution, I should say, right? And likewise, along the, cutting the data along the career arrangements within the family, right? So in particular, are both partners full-time employed? are, can we identify can we actually identify the effect of the peer effect that we identify on the spouse of the father, right? So in many ways, we have just kind of scratched the surface. The other thing is we look just at the take-up decision itself in the year following the birth, right? But this is 2006. We have follow-up now, so we could actually there's a tremendous amount of follow-up that can happen. In terms of the location, to go back to your question, one of the things that I'm curious about would be to leave the workplace type consideration behind and try to define the peer group by locally defined neighborhoods, right? Now I haven't, so instead of defining the peer group by who you work with, to define the peer group by who lives around you, right? Now that might be actually quite hard for confidentiality reasons, as you might imagine, right? Yeah, plenty to do.
Yes, very, very interesting. So we have a question. Can you clarify in what sense peer effect is different than companies' culture or attitude towards parental leave within a company?
Yes, so, well, okay. So what we are estimating is what is the causal effect of an individual becoming eligible for this paternity leave in your workplace and then taking that paternity leave, right? So I'm calling that peer effect, and that might, in your mind, that might conjure up a picture of, oh, I see my peer doing it. This is actually something that me as a male, I can do without it like injuring my fragile masculine identity or something like that. But it might also be more prosaically something like, there's a man who did it in my workplace, so HR actually has gotten used to the idea of just processing these type of things, right? And we cannot separately identify this, right? We cannot distinguish those two mechanisms. Similarly, as what we cannot tell is to what extent are men worried about not signaling to their employers that they are sufficiently committed to their work, and they therefore don't take paternity leave because they don't want to give the impression that they are not committed to their work, right? We can't separate those mechanisms. In the write-up, the research write-up, I discussed some qualitative interviews that are very interesting. So I don't have the name on the top of my mind here, but there are qualitative studies on interview studies in qualitative work that's unfortunately the case, small numbers of individuals who are then being asked about their motivations and so on. And so that type of research, I think, would be more of that type of research would be possibly capable of shedding light on the precise mechanism within this causal effect that I estimate.
Yeah, wonderful. Very interesting. And I think that kind of gets to another question that we have in the chat here, which is, can you hypothesize on the type of peer effects that affects the uptake of parental leave between male coworkers? So the qualitative piece, I think, as you're alluding to, is extremely important to kind of define what that could be.
Yeah, I think that's, you need the qualitative piece to actually get into the minds of people, right? That can motivate then quantitative research of the type that I have just presented, right? And I think in my answer to the prior question, I did hypothesize somewhat, but I wouldn't want to claim like any particularly, like I have my ideas, but you might just as well pick somebody from the street and ask them about their ideas. So what I can speak to is that effect that I demonstrated, right? Yeah, I'm sorry that is maybe not very satisfactory, but
I think that's
best I can do.
Yeah, no, that's good. And then we have another one here. If you were to follow up with this study with data from 2019, should we expect to see a smaller effect because there has been peer effects across provinces?
So there has been a growth in parental leave taking, parental leave taking among fathers across Canada. It hasn't been very strong. So I actually would expect similar size peer effects in different parts of the country just on that basis. Right? I think that in many ways, just the pure fraction of fathers that are willing to take peer is a good indicator. Willing to take parental leave is probably a pretty good proxy for a lot of social processes going on. Peer effects across provinces. I mean, I do think that these peer effects might exist in a very broad sense, like that it becomes culturally more appropriate to talk about taking parental leave, right? And so younger generations might grow up with a mindset where it is actually more appropriate, maybe even expected of fathers to actually take part in the raising of children, maybe also and facilitating the careers of their partners. So but those peer effects, if you think about my empirical setup here, those type of peer effects are not going to be easily captured by that, by the type of empirical study that I'm presenting here, right? So I think it is important to actually just like keep in mind the limitations of the particular studies, the particular setups that we are studying, and the particular setup that I'm studying here is comparing workers within the firm and how their behavior changes with the behavior of peers within the same firm. So yeah.
Awesome. And we have another one. So out of those taking parental leave, did you measure the mother's income as having potential impact on decision? In the instance, you know, the mother earns more than the father, or is that a potential, like, is that a possibility for future research?
Yes, so we have started looking at some of these things. So we don't have very clean results yet. We just got our first results cleared by our RDC last week, which is what I presented today. What we have started looking for is what I described earlier, which are these peer effects within couples, right? So just as, maybe this goes a little bit to the cultural question that was raised earlier. So you could imagine estimating the same type of setup, but looking at the spouses of mothers, right? So what I'm trying to say here is like, imagine a mother of a newborn whose spouse works with somebody who has taken parental leave before, right? This is a more indirect form of peer effect, right? And to what extent does it extend along that? Okay, I have to admit I kind of lost the connection to the question. Oh yeah, you wanted to look across the income distribution. That's another cut. The income distribution with both incomes in the couple, right? That's another cut that we can definitely pursue. That's actually, our data is already quite well set up for doing that. So you know, but it'll take a little bit of time.
That's awesome. And I think we have time for, we'll try to get 2 more in, but maybe just 1 more question. Was the age of the father a factor? For example, do younger fathers take more parental leave than older ones? And again, I think this could be really good for future research as well.
Yes, so I mean, we have run specifications where we're controlling for age. I don't remember the actual effects on those variables, and I actually and we haven't run this heterogeneous effects of the peer effect on the age of fathers. The reason for that is that now we are that requires cutting the data along one more dimension, right? And so the data does become somewhat thin, especially as long as we can't well identify the establishments. So I mean, one of the, you see, like, because we are limiting ourselves already to the set of smaller firms, so we are losing a lot of employees from that. And then, you know, if we then cut further by age group, we're going to lose, our sample sizes are going to get smaller. Now, the 2019 reform, actually, that happens on all of Canada. So we just kind of quadrupled our sample size. So that there's an option there. And having actually establishment identifiers would be extremely useful for expanding our sample size as well. right? So that we are better able to deal with multi-establishment firms. Or, and that's probably the more practical direction, to use the location data that Haley alluded to earlier.
Great, thank you. I think I want to try to squeeze in one more question. Grant, I don't know if you want to ask your question really quickly, or if we, I don't know, can Grant hear me?
I can do that. I can do that.
Fabulous.
Fabian, what's the intensive extensive margin decision like? Once you decide to take the leave, are you generally taking the whole thing, or is it a two-part decision that you observe?
Yeah, so what happens mostly is that the fathers will take the 5 weeks, right? The 5 weeks offered through paternity leave. We see very few, I mean, it does happen, but we see few fathers actually taking more than that paternity leave. So that qualitative research that I was referring to earlier speaks of essentially within the couple, it seems like women are in some sense having property rights over this parental leave and want to take a lot of that parental leave themselves, right? So the distribution of parental, I'm just citing this qualitative research, that's not my own, right? Citing is exaggerated, referencing it. But in terms of empirically, what we see is that once a paternity leave gets instituted, the weeks that essentially the woman cannot take, the mother cannot take, those are the ones that the father will be taking, but they will rarely go above that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, you know what, we have time for maybe just one really quick one, because I want to get to all the questions really quick. Okay, so Neeru had a question. I was wondering if you had data on whether the employer provided top-up benefits to offer the parent 100% of income protection rather than the lower percentage offered through the parental benefit program.
Very good question. I wish I knew how to answer it. We haven't exploited that. We have the T4s and the T1s, right? So if that type of information is on the income statements, which it should be, I think, then we should be able to actually obtain that. This is actually great. We should be able to obtain that data, because that would also tell us something about an earlier question that was raised about like the culture of the workplace, right? So you might imagine that this identifies firms that are just more amenable to family-friendly policies, right? But we like so my answer to the simple answer to this is the data might contain it. We haven't looked for it.
That would be very interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to present. It was amazing and a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to move on to our third and final presenter of the day, Tammy Schirle. So Tammy is a professor of economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's also a co-editor for Canadian Public Policy, the former director of the Laurier Centre for Economic Research and Policy Analysis, a board member for the Canadian Labour Economics Forum, and a C.D. Howe Institute Fellow in Residence. Take it away, Tammy.
Thank you. Your introduction makes me sound very busy. So thank you everyone for coming to come and talk to us, or hear me about our research. It's always fun to come and talk to people about things I've had fun working on for the past while. And I'll just mention as well, this is work with my co-authors, Anna Ferrer and Annie Pan. I'll just kind of highlight that Annie, well, she had been working with a group at the University of Toronto for the most part while we were working on this project, has since joined Statistics Canada. So congratulations to her, but I will emphasize that when it comes to those disclaimers about the opinions being expressed, they are mine and mine alone. So she should not take any responsibility for that. Neither should Anna, for that matter. Now, the motivation for the work that we did with this grant really came from this narrative that we're always telling and hearing about how married women work so differently in the labor market than men, and even single women and single men. And so if you look back at the Royal Commission's report from 1970, you'll see this nicely characterized, that married women tend to move in and out of the labor force a lot more than men do. And the nature of their decisions are different. In particular, that the income of their husbands is a key factor in whether or not they would be participating in the labor force. And some of us are old enough to remember, back in the day, having that woman having to work to provide necessities for your family had a certain stigma to it. So this was certainly, the context in which these decisions were being made back in 1970. And if you were to look historically at what the workforce looked like at the time, that narrative certainly would have rung true. It would have resonated with a lot of people. So here back in 1976, if you were looking at the participation rates of married women across Canada, less than half of those women were participating in the labor force. Whereas if you were looking at married men in 1976, the vast majority of them are participating in the labor force. So it would make sense to see that very big distinction between married women and married men and how their decisions are being made. But then, of course, we see so much has changed over time. Some things haven't, but so much has changed over time, so that married women's participation rates have risen dramatically over the years. And when you're looking over here, my last points are 2021 here. That gap between married women and single men and single women has pretty much disappeared entirely. That's just a margin of error there. And more importantly, this gap that we had between married men and married women has narrowed incredibly by a very large amount, right? So you can imagine that when I take that narrative that we still find in our textbooks into my classroom and I'm telling these young women about how married women are so different, it just doesn't resonate with them, right? We need to sort of revisit how we're thinking about the decisions that are being made. And so that was what really underlied the motivation to moving into this project, just going back over time and mapping out how people move through the labor market, okay? And we're going to be focusing here on people who are entering the labor market. So they're not participating and they're going to move into unemployment or employment. We're going to map out how that looks over time. What's the likelihoods there? And then we're also going to have a few stories that we're working on with respect to what are the kinds of things that matter in their decisions. Okay, there's 3 of them that I'm going to tell you about today. The first is what we call these added worker effects. This is where a non-participating wife, normally in the story, sees that their spouse has lost their job, and so they'll add themselves to the labor force in order to help support the family. We're going to look for that. We're going to think about children, always important. We have children for many reasons. They are absolutely cute, but they are also barriers to entering the labor market because you need to make sure that they are cared for. And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what we call discouraged workers. So this is where people might be searching for work. They get discouraged when they can't find it right away, and they might give up. And our focus here in all of these stories is looking for those gender differences in how people behave. Now, the data here throughout is using the labor force survey, and this is what we've accessed in the RDCs. We're using the master files. If you're ever interested in trying to pick those up, Pierre Brochu recently published an article with Canadian Public Policy that lays out some of the good and bad and the ugly in trying to use those files. But the main reason we want to use them is that the monthly survey is done monthly so that we can get unemployment rates every month for EI. But what we can do with the master files is connect people in households over the course of 6 months, which allows us to see month to month to month whether or not they have changed what they're doing in the labor market, okay? Another key point in using those files is that we connect individuals to their spouses and all of their family members, really. So we can make those connections between how families are making their decisions. And then we have a large set of different characteristics, things like your age, your education, other things about you. One of the things, though, that I'll highlight for this group that we're very limited in what we can see here. There is no gender identity question in the labor force survey. So whenever I'm talking about men and women, I'm really talking about the people who have been identified by themselves as female or male for the purposes of the labor force survey. Okay, I just want to make that clear. It's only recently that we've introduced any visible minority status questions that would allow us to think about race and ethnicity, and we have nothing at all when it comes to people's abilities or disabilities, however we want to characterize those. So those are certainly limitations of the data. But here I'm just going to jump right into showing you some of the results that we've put together here. So one of the things we're interested in is taking a look at those individuals who are not currently in the labor force. What are the chances that they're going to join? okay, and then start searching for work. And that's where they enter unemployment. And over time, it's always been the case that any men who are not in the labor force, they're going to have a higher likelihood here of joining and searching for a job than women are. That's always been lower for women, okay? But what we've seen over time is that that likelihood of women coming in to start searching for work has increased over time. And interestingly, for men, there's more of a cyclical component to this. You can see a couple of big recessions there, but more importantly, their likelihood of making that move to start searching for work, that's been declining over time, okay? For us, what that means is that that gap between men and women and how they're behaving when they're not participating in the labor force, that has narrowed over the course of the 40 years that we see here. Similarly, when we're looking at a person who's not in the labor force, do they jump into employment 1 month to the next? The probability of that has changed over time in a very different way. Very strange patterns here, I think, but it's always higher for men. Men are more likely to enter employment than women are. For our purposes, though, one thing that we're interested in pointing out is that this gap that we saw 20 years ago was much larger than the gap we see now between men and women. So again, you know, there's still some differences here in these probabilities, but those differences have been narrowing over time. Now, some of that is just going to be the things that affect everybody in the labor market over time. Part of it, though, is what's different over generations. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, I'm looking at women, and I'm looking at what are their chances of entering unemployment based on their age. That's what's on the bottom axis there. And each of those lines is telling you about a different generation of women. So this bottom black lines here are women born in the 1920s and the 1930s. They had a very, very low chance of moving from non-participation into the labor force. When you get the baby boomers coming in, much more likely at all ages to start looking for work if they find themselves away from the labor force. And then, of course, you know, as you get towards your Gen X and later, women who are, you know, much younger in their age profiles, probably having kids around these ages, they're also now more likely to be moving into the labor force. And so all of this has been changing across generations. And so I think there's some really interesting generational differences to pull out of these stories. Now, one of the things that we wanted to talk about with the added workers here was thinking about the extent to which people respond to a spouse losing a job. Now, to give you a sense of what this graph is going to pull in, we ran some models controlling for a whole bunch of things going on in women's lives, taking the women who are not participating in the labor force at the moment and saying, okay, what are the odds that you're going to join the labor force and how much do they increase if your spouse loses a job? Okay, this first dot is looking at a case where a woman has just seen their spouse lose their job. So this is like within the past couple of weeks, 0 months since their spouse moved out of employment. They have now increased their chances of entering the labor force. Okay, so they seem to be responding in that way of, you know, joining in to help support the family. But we see a much bigger effect a month later. So 1 month after your spouse has lost their job, you've probably gone without a couple of paychecks at this point for some families, right? Their likelihood of entering the labor force is much, much higher now than it was before compared to other women in similar circumstances whose spouses didn't lose their job, okay? But that starts to quickly dissipate, you know, by the time you're 2 months away from your spouse losing their job, or 3 or 4 months away from your spouse losing their job, that impact isn't going to change your decisions anymore. It's really that immediate, you know, first month after a spouse has lost their job that you're going to respond by looking for work yourself. Now, part of what we wanted to do here was to see how the story has changed historically. So we mapped in the same kind of story, taking women who are not participating, but now from the 1980s, okay, to see how different they are. And you do see there's still this effect that when their spouse loses their job, they're going to be more likely to join the labor force and start looking for work, but it's not nearly as large as it is in the 2010s, which I think, this is just telling stories at this point, I think it just reflects how prepared women are to join the labor force in the 2010s compared to where they might have been sitting in the 1980s, right? It's that generational difference that we're going to be capturing in part here. And then finally, you know, just filling in the 1990s and the 2000s there for you as well. I think the big gap here is with those women in the 1980s. compared to later generations. So overall, you know, in the paper, we're going to look into, you know, how this differs across different groups of women. Higher educated women seem to respond more in terms of joining. You know, having those kids at home makes it a little bit more difficult. But one thing that I wanted to highlight was that when we take that group of men who are not participating in the labor force and they see their spouse lose their job, they also respond by becoming more likely to enter the labor force. And that happens across all of these decades that we're looking at. So it's not that men and women here are actually all that different. Here's somewhere where, given they are in a similar situation, they actually seem to respond very similarly in how they work with their families, which I think was something that was missing from our literature in the past. We just didn't really look for it. So then a second part of our work here was looking for whether or not having kids matters. So these transition rates here are taking a group of people who are not in the labor force, given the age of their youngest child here, and you know, how likely are they to decide to enter the labor force. Okay, men generally, again, more likely to enter the labor force than women are. They also have, seems like, a declining profile here, less and less likely as their kids get older, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but I'll get to that. And then we see a bit of a shape here where age 0 is a different thing on its own, but after age 1, you know, we see women becoming more and more likely to enter the labor force as their kids get older. Now, the problem with these numbers is they're raw. There's so much going on in these people's lives, right? People are getting older as their kids get older. Unfortunately, that happens, right? So we decided to control for all of that, right? Who is not in the labor force at all of these different times? What ages are they compared to the age of their youngest child? And once you net out those kinds of differences and you look for how much more likely married fathers are to join the labor force relative to the age of their child, it's just noise. There is absolutely no relationship there. Having kids for dads does not matter in terms of their likelihood of joining the labor force. For moms, all of these numbers here, by the way, are relative to having an age 2 kid. For moms, though, you can see very clearly a pattern here where as kids get older, they're more and more likely to be entering the labor force. So that's where, you know, kids are wonderful, but they seem to be a barrier to the labor force for moms, but not for dads. And that's where there's that important gender difference to look for there. Now, one of the other things that we were looking for was whether or not women tend to be more likely discouraged when they're searching for work and then leave the labor force entirely. Okay, and when you look at the raw numbers for, you know, what are your chances of giving up and walking away from unemployment, those are definitely higher for women, and that has persisted over time. But again, we see that gap between men and women narrowing over time. Okay, so again, whatever is going on in determining these patterns, women and men are getting together in terms of their behavior here. Now, one of the things that I find difficult in wrapping my own head around is, you know, what is making them leave? Are they really discouraged? Are there many other reasons? You can imagine there's gender differences in the many reasons that you might decide to walk away from unemployment and move on to doing something else. So one thing we tried to do was line up that chance of leaving unemployment and moving into non-participation with your local unemployment rates. And we tried to do this on the economic region level so that you're thinking about your unemployment rates that matter for EI. And when you look across this, there simply is no pattern over time. There doesn't really seem to be any gender differences. Most of these aren't even statistically significant. And so there wasn't, I was expecting an obvious story here and there wasn't one. So this is one of the pieces where we're just saying, you know what, we're going to leave this aside for now and we're going to come back to the story because there should be something that helps us understand what's going on here. So to give you a quick summary, you know, this is the kind of work that we got to do with this grant, but we actually saw this really as a starting point for many more things. And that's what this kind of grant was great for. So after doing, mapping out all of these transitions and doing these first steps into the data, we have many pieces that are moving forward. So for example, we have one paper drafting right now, and it's been hard at work, thinking about how there are differences between men and women who are recent immigrants and those who are Canadian born. There's some interesting transition differences there. Looking at those responses of the non-participating spouse. Well, we also want to think about dual earner couples who might change how many hours they're working in response to a spouse being laid off. I'm finding some great stuff there. Anyone who's seen me talk about this before, I got some good stuff working in the RDC this week. figured out my problems. I also have a piece coming just focusing on those parents who are trying to re-enter the labor market and how policy supports might be designed to think about, you know, supporting them and supporting the moms with the kids differently than we would normally think of dads who are unemployed. And then finally, as I said, we're going to be returning to those discouraged workers. For a lot of people who are here today, you know, I hope that the type of work that we're doing, just sort of laying that information foundation is the kind of stuff that helps build and design a better policy to support people who are making those transitions through the labor market. I think, unfortunately, a fair criticism of many policies is that people tend to do the GBA plus after the policy is already there, as opposed to taking this information and building it from the ground up. And so I hope that this does help there. Thinking about how these traditional gender roles persist and where they don't necessarily, thinking about how families work and how kids play such an important role in everything that we do, and, you know, the various unique challenges that are out there. And that is where I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy. That was amazing. I'm going to kick off the Q&A real quick because of, you know, seeing the impact of children. I'm really curious about, like, you know, the national childcare policy, right? Making affordable childcare, $10 a day childcare across Canada, and that potential impact. Yes, so we're looking at the age of the youngest children, and we're looking at that. Do you see that could be a potential impact? And again, just thinking about how Quebec has already kind of had that. It's been there for a few years now. If you've ever looked at Quebec versus the rest of Canada.
So this is a tricky conversation. I'm just going to highlight that because there's two parts to this. What past research has shown us, especially with that Quebec policy as, you know, a great example, we love our Quebec rest of Canada things, you know, is that having that childcare much more affordable did lead to this large increase in participation rates among women. Okay, so do you get to stay in the labor force is margin number one, right? And that's where we've seen many more women staying in the labor force, building careers that let them stay in the labor force, and having those long-term implications. So there's a huge body of research just defining that. Okay, now what's going to sit in contrast to that, which I find a bit more difficult to talk about, is that this is looking at those women who are not in the labor force. So for whatever reason, over all of these decades, I've got the 1980s to the 2010s here as a separate lines. Over all of those decades, there's really no difference between these women, right? That has not changed. So there's still a matter that once you're out of the labor force, getting back in is a challenge. Now, childcare is going to matter there, right? Part of that is that, you know, you can have cheap childcare, but are there spaces? These are the women who didn't find spaces. Or so let me qualify that. There are some women here who just love being at-home moms, do it, love it, enjoy it. There are many women who had to weigh out the benefits and say, my salary is not going to cover that childcare space, or I'm on a waiting list for 3 years, right? So there's a combination of people here. And for all of those reasons, those women are out of the labor force. The fact that there is this gradient tells me, or suggests to me, that if there were more childcare spaces available, not just cheaper, but spaces, then you would see more of these women coming in more quickly. So then you would see some shift in this. That's me speculating because I can't pin that down as easily with this data, but I think that is where, you know, the existence of this gradient speaks to whether or not there is enough childcare available.
That's a very good point. Thank you. We have another question in the chat. I'm going to start with this one. We have Alex is interested or curious about the presentation software tool that you used. It's very clear and engaging, and I second that. This is amazing.
Thank you. It's Beamer, and I've got it open in GoodNotes 5, which gives me the nice little lines that disappear.
Very nice. Okay, and our next question. Could you talk a bit about gender difference in employment persistence? So probability of employment at T +1 given employment at T.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I didn't try to fit that all in today, and I'm not going to try and pull it out of my memory for you. But we do have, so for whenever you have a probability of entering, you're going to also have people leaving employment at the same time. And that persistence in employment for women has increased over time as well. So that's certainly the case here. And if I remember correctly, there was a narrowing in that gender gap as well. So men always had a very high persistence in employment. So staying employed month to month. For women, that was lower, and that has narrowed over time. I'm not going to pretend that I can pull numbers out of my head for exactly how big those gaps were, though.
Very interesting. Thank you. Do we have any more questions this afternoon?
For Grant's comment, there is a new textbook chapter coming, anyway, for our students.
I am very curious because I can't recall, but have you been able to look at education correlating as well? Like, have you been able to take a look at education? Because I think I saw income, but was there education, like level of attainment?
So we did some education breakouts when we were looking for these added worker effects, and that's where it was the highly educated women who were more easily responding quickly to a spouse losing work. They could jump into the labor force more quickly. Unfortunately, when we start doing these breakdowns to get things vetted out of the RDC with small education cells, we can't do that very easily. So we've held on to those in the RDC at the moment.
Awesome, thank you. Oh, good one. Good question. Did you look at part-time versus full-time participation for women and men?
Not here. I have, tried to look at some of that data in the past because when it comes to a lot of policies that we have, there's a concern that we might be bringing a lot of women into the labor market, but only part-time. And I don't think that was so much the case in Canada as it was in many European countries. But I haven't looked at that specifically here.
Perfect, thank you. Wonderful. I think that's all we have for questions. Last call for questions. We do have a comment of someone just thanking, thank you for making the data so understandable, and thanks to all presenters. And so glad WAGE is making these types of presentations available. So yes, we absolutely love funding this research, and we thank absolutely everyone who presented today. We have lots of work to do on our end from a policy, programs, and service standpoint, but thank you everyone for taking the time and joining us today. And Grant, oh, of course. And Grant, I don't know if you are planning to do a bigger close off.
I do just want to say we have a satisfaction survey for today. Your answers will be anonymous, but if everyone could just grab this link and let us know what you thought of today, that helps us plan for the future. Appreciate it very much. So I just popped that into the chat for everyone.
Awesome.
And then Ryan popped into the chat with some text, which is better. Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And have a good rest of your day.